Welcome to our lesson on the properties of water, looking at density. In this lesson, you will identify the difference between mass and weight, and you will understand the factors that affect the density of water. But firstly, let's look at some terms. Mass. Mass is the amount of matter in a substance. So how much stuff makes something up? However, this is different than weight. Weight is the force with which the earth pulls on a substance. So our mass is always the same. But if we're on Earth, we have a certain weight. I may weigh 145 pounds on Earth. But if I was on the moon, my weight might be half of that because gravity forces are different. So mass is never changing. Weight is based on how much force is being placed on an object. Which leads us to the question of what weighs more. 50 kilograms of iron or 50 kilograms of feathers. If you said that they are equal, they both weigh the same, you would be correct. However, if we go to the question of density, which has a greater density, the iron or the feathers? If you said the iron, you'd be correct. The weight of the iron is compact into a small object, while the feathers are big and spread out. The density is much greater, more matter in a smaller space. And this leads us to our first shout out. What is the difference between mass and weight? You might have to pause the video or rewind, but write this question down first. And if you said mass is the amount of matter in an object or substance, or in simple terms, how much stuff makes up an object? And if you said weight is the amount of force that the earth pulls on an object, you'd be correct. So now we move on to density as a function of temperature, which is a fancy way of saying how does temperature affect density? And for most substances, as temperature increases, the volume increases. And as a result, density increases. You boil water, it turns to a gas, and its volume grows, but it's lighter. It floats in the air. Most substances are that way. That's the rule. However, water has another unique characteristic. As it gets colder, it should become denser. The material should become more packed and sink. However, ice floats. And if you think about in your freezer, you freeze water. The ice is larger than the water you put into the ice cube tray. That's because water is at its greatest density when it is simply in a state as a liquid. And then it has greater volume as it heats up and a greater volume as it freezes and is lighter. So, shout out. You might want to pause the video once again and write this question down. How does a cold temperature change the density of water? If you said cold and frozen water is lighter and floats, you would be correct. And that leads us to the question of density in other fluids. If we look here, this is called a fluid tower. And you can see on the side here, they've labeled different types of fluids: honey, corn syrup, dish soap, water, vegetable oil. Which fluid do you think is the lightest? If you said the vegetable oil, because it's on top, you'd be correct. And that's because it has if you said the vegetable oil on top, you'd be correct. And that is because its density is less than the water, therefore it floats. And the most dense fluid would be the honey on the bottom. And that's how density works. Objects are able to float because of their density. And when we deal with water, cold water is lighter than warm water, so it floats. However, when water gets to a certain heat and boils, it starts to float once again. So there's kind of a middle ground of heat. And sort of an interesting little picture here. We have a lead pool ball floating on top of mercury. The mercury's density is much greater than water, therefore, an object made of lead is able to float. And other factors that affect density is what other factors that affect density are what is dissolved in that water. If we look down here, this fellow is raking salt into water, and up here is a picture of the ocean. It's easier to float in the ocean because the water is much more dense because there's salt in it. The salt allows the water molecules to connect together better and become more dense. So depending what your concentration and what types of materials you have in your water, it can affect the density of water and how objects float in it, and how heat is held. Now your homework. I want you to think back to all the factors that affect the density of water, things such as heat and solutes. I want you to describe those factors and submit them online.